Let me just give me a minute. I want to take your time. Look. Okay, can you swear here? Can you swear? Okay. The Oscars, you know? The Oscars! You!
When it comes to video games, 2015 was nothing else if not an interesting time. Store shelves in the Western Shores were graced with some of the greatest games ever made, some bestsellers, and even a few tragedies. Over in the Eastern Shores though, hidden away from the public eye, one developer was busy pitching an idea over to Nintendo of Japan. While other companies might have been keen to work on Zelda or Mario, this one was interested in remaking a game from one of Nintendo's other IPs, Metroid Fusion. Around the same time this was going down, Yoshio Sakamoto, the producer of the Metroid series, happened to be playing around with the idea of remaking a different game entirely, recognizing the developer's name from somewhere else. With his interest piqued, he decided to try out their most recent handiwork on the Nintendo 3DS. Their only 3DS release at this time was a side-scrolling action game with elements of exploration. The game featured mechanics involving parrying enemy attacks to open them up for counterattacks, performing flashy cinematic takedowns on enemies, and acquiring a number of unique abilities tied to a finite resource. These even include skills that automatically negate damage from enemies and environmental hazards, which otherwise cannot be crossed safely. You might be thinking I'm just describing Metroid Samus Returns right now, and there's a really good reason for that. I'm not talking about Samus Returns. I'm actually talking about MercurySteam's first 3DS game, Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate. The game which would set off a chain of events eventually culminating with the overdue release of Metroid Dread. Mirror of Fate might seem completely irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, but it's a game that introduces a different perspective to MercurySteam's work on Metroid. Although Samus Returns was a collaborative effort between Nintendo and MercurySteam, the bulk of its development team was the very same behind Mirror of Fate. Not to mention, Mirror of Fate was the game that convinced Yoshio Sakamoto to personally meet with the Spain-based developer and discuss a remake of the series' most unique entry. However, so much time had passed since the last 2D Metroid, indie developers had begun creating games inspired by Metroid and Castlevania's shared legacy, such as Ori and the Blind Forest, Momodora, Reverie Under the Moonlight, and Blasphemous. Metroid once stood as a titan of an entire subgenre all its own, and MercurySteam was tasked with reviving Metroid during an entire renaissance of these search action games, or whatever label you want to slap onto them. It's also important to stress that by this point in time, MercurySteam had no real foothold in these exploration-based games. If you knew MercurySteam, it was almost certainly for their combat-heavy Castlevania games. And yet, their work on Mirror of Fate somehow resulted in not only a Metroid 2 remake, but the first original 2D Metroid in 19 years. There initially doesn't seem to be anything particularly remarkable about these three games, but for every distinction between them, there's a similarity or design quirk they all have in common. Together, these three games tell a story, and as with any good story, this one begins in the heart of Romania.
No. No! Show me more, damn it! That's not enough. I need to see more.
The second game in the Castlevania Lords of Shadow trilogy, Mirror of Fate is the strange middle child of the series. While Lords of Shadow 1 and 2 center around MercurySteam's beloved Castlevania OC, Gabriel Belmont, Mirror of Fate was intentionally designed as a throwback to the most defining classic games of the Castlevania series. In fact, according to Lords of Shadow's producer, David Cox, Mirror of Fate's main source of inspiration was Castlevania 3: Dracula's Curse. On the surface, it seems like Mirror of Fate has everything that endeared fans of Castlevania to the series to begin with. The game centers around three fan-favorite characters, Alucard, Trevor, and Simon Belmont, on a journey into a monster-filled castle to slay Lord Dracula. In spite of Mirror of Fate borrowing from the earlier Castlevania games, there was also a deliberate decision to focus more on exploration compared to the first Lords of Shadow. Granted, Mirror of Fate was referred to as a pure action game in the interviews following its announcement, but just as much attention was brought to the game's exploration elements, sometimes in the exact same interview. Even one passing glance at the game's basically open-world environment suggests that there's more to Mirror of Fate than pure action. There's upgrades to find all throughout Dracula's castle, grid-based maps of the castle's different areas, and even teleporters to cut down on any backtracking between them. Naturally, this combination of action and exploration immediately brings to mind other Castlevania games like Symphony of the Night or Aria of Sorrow, and those games are still beloved by fans, aren't they? Knowing that Mirror of Fate was what springboarded MercurySteam into working on Metroid, you would think the company's first stab at a 2D action exploration game was a certified classic, right?
You cannot pass yet, Trevor.
Unfortunately, Mirror of Fate is a game wrapped up in a bit of a nasty identity crisis. Not only is Mirror of Fate trying to adapt Lords of Shadow 1's gameplay into a 2D space, but it's also trying to work in elements from the genre-defining exploration-based games produced by Koji Igarashi. Similar games have managed to marry engaging 2D combat with a sprawling world to explore, but the same can't be said for Mirror of Fate. You see, there are two very fundamental concepts that make games like Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night click: action and exploration. These two aspects are what I consider to be the two most defining pillars of these games and their many, many derivatives. These elements are intrinsically connected to one another throughout the entire game, especially in the case of Castlevania. The majority of upgrades in the exploration-based Castlevanias usually have some kind of combat utility to use on enemies obstructing your progress. Even when you aren't getting upgrades that increase your offensive options, the exploratory Castlevanias give you more than enough new weapons and subsystems to ensure that combat never stays stale. This nearly imperceptible balancing mechanism becomes second nature over time. You're always killing enemies to explore more of the map, just as much as you're exploring while you kill enemies. Action and exploration. The vast majority of these games are balanced around the relationship between these two core aspects of the genre, with similar games placing varying degrees of emphasis on one over the other. It's something you don't notice until it's missing, which is why the disconnect between the two halves is so obvious in Mirror of Fate. You can fight and you can explore, but very rarely does the game build its maps with both in mind. Mirror of Fate's core gameplay is fine enough for the most part, dealing damage with whip strikes and guard breaks, parrying enemy attacks, and using sub-weapons or spells to open enemies up. When it all comes together, there's actually some pretty solid stuff here, and there's no doubt that most of the work went into this combat system. However, enemy encounters only take place in predetermined combat arenas, where only a few enemies can be fought at a single time. Since enemies are restricted to specific combat zones, Mirror of Fate's level design doesn't rely on enemies to impede your exploration. Exploring through Dracula's castle instead involves semi-automated platforming sections and some basic puzzles. While these sections might have been intended as a callback to the perilous platforming in classic Castlevania games, they're instead more reminiscent of your average Uncharted game. Despite Mirror of Fate's progression segregating combat and exploration, there's at least still a castle to explore, with new upgrades and abilities to find. This could have been a chance to introduce new skills that diversify the game's platforming sections and offer some much needed variety, but Mirror of Fate's upgrades only exist to further serve the game's combat. For example, there's Alucard's stopwatch subweapon. It's introduced early on in a room where you need to slow down time to get past a timing-based platforming section. This is pretty basic stuff, but it sets up the expectation that the stopwatch will be required to get through similar sections of the castle. Except this is the only time the stopwatch is ever used like this. Mirror of Fate's upgrades add next to nothing to the game's exploration, with the exception of the game's 5 dedicated movement upgrades. Even then, while these upgrades are meant to unlock new ways of exploring the environment, their utility is extremely situational. There's no flexibility in how your new movement options can be used, and very little is done to use these extra mechanics in a meaningful way. It's telling when the speed boots, arguably the most versatile and flexible movement upgrade in the entire game, is also the very last one you find. These few exploration-based upgrades aren't just limited in utility by in-game mechanics, but also because of the game's aggressively linear map design. Mirror of Fate does very little to hide the fact that the different areas of Dracula's castle are basically segmented levels, rather than properly interconnected areas. No matter which character you play as, the castle's different areas are designed primarily to push you forward, rather than branching out into inaccessible rooms or different areas entirely. Unlike other Castlevanias, there's no revisiting older parts of the map with new skills to access the inaccessible. Going out of your way to do so in Mirror of Fate will net you optional health and magic upgrades, but the game throws so many of these at you as is that there's almost no point. It's actually kind of funny, given that levels will sometimes ask the player to backtrack to older areas with a new upgrade in tow, only to streamline the process entirely with easy shortcuts to earlier areas. There's this feeling that MercurySteam wanted players to experience Mirror of Fate as they intended, limiting the amount of freedom available to the player so that they couldn't even skip a second of the game. This may not seem like that big of an indictment, but there's a problem when you can't even take small shortcuts in the game's own platforming. In a genre known for letting players move around and explore maps of all different sizes, Mirror of Fate is the only game I can think of that uses the most underhanded means of railroading players. There's no doubt a lot still yet to be said about Mirror of Fate, but I think this is enough to give you a general introduction to the type of experience that MercurySteam's first 2D game has to offer. After all, this was the game that ultimately acted as the bridge between MercurySteam and Nintendo's future partnership. The most important takeaway isn't meant to be about Mirror of Fate's quality, but what the game ultimately amounts to: a linear, combat-driven experience that denies any attempt to deviate from the intended path. MercurySteam themselves did say that Mirror of Fate was primarily a 2D conversion of Lords of Shadow's gameplay formula, and the game only really works on those terms alone. All those other claims of exploration and an open world environment amount to a world that fails to fully realize what made those other exploration-based Castlevania games work. Mirror of Fate does have its share of good ideas, but the game comes to a close just before any of them can be fully realized. Somehow, after his experience with the game, Yoshio Sakamoto saw that MercurySteam was a team with talent and good design sensibility, deciding to pursue the company in the hopes of realizing Metroid's future. In the end, Metroid's future was in the hands of the Mirror of Fate team. Given that MercurySteam wasn't just making the first 2D Metroid game in 13 years, but were also competing against a wave of new Metroid-inspired games, which includes the fan-made Metroid 2 remake AM2R, expectations were extremely high for the Spain-based company to deliver. The fruits born of the collaboration between Nintendo and MercurySteam would be their 2017 release, Metroid: Samus Returns. Though generally praised as a much-needed return to form for the series by both critics and fans alike, not everyone was singing the same happy tune.
Samus Returns doesn't just accidentally fail to capture the feeling of Metroid 2 by updating things, but it specifically undermines the original game in boorish, boneheaded ways.
Samus Returns is a remake of Metroid 2 that not only adapts, but also expands upon the base of the original game. These expansions include the introduction of new gameplay mechanics, upgrades not featured in the original game, redesigned Metroid encounters, and further fleshing out Samus's journey into SR388, closer tying the events of Metroid 2 with the rest of the series. The most interesting part about Samus Returns is how MercurySteam, a company fresh off a series of action games, was the one working on the franchise best known for its exploration and sense of discovery. The end result was the first 2D Metroid that tried to experiment with something that the series hadn't really done in 24 years. As the 2D Metroid series received entry after new entry, the game steadily improved upon the amount of control players had over Samus. Given its status as the series' starting point, Metroid 1's control was just barely on the level of games like Contra or Mega Man. Extremely basic, but more than serviceable for an NES game of the time. The original Metroid 2 added some new features like crouching, downward aiming, and 2 dramatically different mobility upgrades, but there was still plenty of room for improvement. This improvement was properly realized with the release of Super Metroid in 1994, leading to arguably the greatest turning point in the series. Everything in Super Metroid was improved upon from prior games, whether it was the game's stronger map design or Samus's own abilities, with equal amounts of new offensive options and movement tech to use. Though Metroid 1 was the game that laid the foundation, Super Metroid is the entry that introduced nearly every mechanic or feature that's still commonly associated with the series to this very day. Following up on Super Metroid was Metroid Fusion, which had its own share of new features, such as the introduction of ledge gripping and Shine Spark chaining, but consolidated and streamlined aspects of the controls and mechanics to suit the move to a handheld system. Fusion's follow-up was Metroid Zero Mission, which would turn out to be the series' last 2D entry for 13 years. Zero Mission sported much more of an open-ended map compared to Fusion, as well as way more movement options, giving players plenty of freedom on how they wanted to play through the game. Both of these Game Boy Advance games respectively focus on providing a more story-driven and a more replayable experience, incrementally adding more options to Samus' base movement. However, the core gameplay in Fusion and Zero Mission remains largely unchanged from what was introduced in Super Metroid. Now, I personally think all three of these games are fantastic in their own right, but the advancements in 2D Metroid's gameplay had more or less reached a standstill after Super Metroid. The thing is, if Metroid continued without pushing its gameplay beyond the standards set by Super Metroid, any new entries would have been accused of being rehashes with little in the way of innovation. And this is about the point where MercurySteam comes in. Of all the countless possible ways the company could have improved and innovated 2D Metroid's gameplay, there's only two words that can best summarize MercurySteam's vision for the Metroid series.
Ruthless aggression!
MercurySteam's remake of Metroid 2 involved reworking its sparse enemy roster to feature some of the most aggressive enemies in the series' history. We're talking about enemies that blitz you the second you're in range, enemies that shave off entire energy tanks per hit, and enemies that'll get the most careless of players real acquainted with the game over screen. To counterbalance the fact that MercurySteam revamped Metroid 2's sparse enemy roster to be 3 times as aggressive, they also introduced 3 brand new mechanics to the Metroid series. Full 360-degree aiming, a parry mechanic known as the melee counter, and a set of special powers known as Aeon abilities. These 3 features are specifically tailored towards the game's combat, marking the first time a 2D Metroid made an honest attempt to bolster the series' combat since Super Metroid's release. That's not to say Samus Returns doesn't still focus on finding new upgrades with widespread utility, but unlike those upgrades, these new mechanics are almost exclusively used to deepen Metroid's core combat. That being said, even I'll admit analog aiming is more of a simple quality of life change than some combat-rich mechanic. Seeing that Samus Returns is the first 2.5D Metroid game, its 3D rendered enemies have a bit more complexity in their movement than sprite-based enemies did, so being able to fine-tune your aiming is a welcome change. MercurySteam even showed restraint in turning the free aiming into a central gameplay gimmick, instead using more natural means of challenging your aiming skills. No, the real highlights of Samus Returns are the Aeon abilities and the melee counter, both of which are new ways to properly counter the game's more relentless enemies. The melee counter is the most direct means of stopping oncoming enemy attacks, parrying and opening them up for a counterattack afterwards. The melee counter marks the first time a 2D Metroid had an actual defensive option besides just jumping over enemy attacks entirely. Unfortunately, it's also one of the most contentious additions to Samus Returns. Since the melee counter is built right into Samus' base moveset, you have easy access to the move at all times. Seeing that you start Samus Returns with only a few missiles between you and the single most aggressive enemy type in the game, it's easy to grow too reliant on the melee counter as a safety net. Because the melee counter is your safest method of dealing with enemies, over-reliance on it will ultimately lock yourself into a stop-and-go flow of gameplay. Clinging to such a parry-dominant mentality through to Samus Returns' ending won't just guarantee the death of your enemies, but also the game's pacing. Fortunately, while the melee counter is the easiest way to deal with enemies in Samus Returns, it's not the only tool in your arsenal. If the melee counter is your shield, then the Aeon abilities are the blade, with 4 skills meant to further broaden your options in combat. The Beam Burst briefly overcharges Samus' arm cannon into a Gatling gun. The Lightning Armor negates all damage on contact. The Phase Drift briefly slows down time. And the Scan Pulse... well, the Scan Pulse kinda sucks. Each of these Aeon abilities runs off a shared resource, meaning that how exactly they're used is defined entirely by your own playstyle. For instance, certain enemies can be ignored altogether with the lightning armor, the beam burst can shred through most normal enemies, and you can even one-cycle an entire boss fight through proper use of the phase drift. Unlike most of your normal upgrades, there's no single defined way in which you should use the Aeon abilities. It's a new layer of depth for Metroid's core gameplay, not dissimilar to the way special weapons work in most Mega Man games. Whether reserved for quick kills on bosses or to make level progression smoother, these special weapons are the meta in Mega Man, which is more or less how Aeon abilities can be used in Samus Returns. With the inclusion of these 3 new mechanics, Samus Returns becomes a strikingly different experience from any 2D Metroid released before it. It's a game that wants you to play aggressively, to make the most of your fancy new tools against the game's tougher enemies and revamped Metroid encounters. MercurySteam is practically inviting you to take the offensive, with the game often funneling you into narrow, enemy-filled corridors. Unfortunately, this funneling also leads into one of the more notorious aspects of Samus Returns. There's really no getting around the fact that Samus Returns is one of the series' more linear entries. Not to the extent of Other M, but more along the lines of Metroid Fusion and Prime 3. These entries used more linear structures to suit the focus on a more involved narrative, but Samus Returns doesn't even have a single word of dialogue beyond the game's intro. So if there's no story to constrict the game's freedom, then what's going on here? To be a little fair to Samus Returns, its linear structure is at least partially owed to the way Metroid 2 was originally designed. The original game's form of progression is like a cozy train ride connecting to different stations, with each of SR388's different areas connected through one single tunnel. This means of progression is part of what gave Metroid 2 its status as the series' black sheep back in the day, which Samus Returns retains to the point of keeping the original game's map layout intact. The finer details are where you start to notice that Samus Returns' actual level design can get very claustrophobic. Before too long, those more open-ended rooms in early areas make way for cramped, tighter hallways with some of the game's deadliest enemies and barely any breathing room. Even knowing how to bypass or work around enemies, it's hard to deny that Samus Returns is constantly pushing you into enemy confrontations. Barely any of the usual downtime in Metroid games is accounted for in Samus Returns, with less time to soak in the atmosphere and even less room to break from the game's intended path. These design choices turn Samus Returns into more of a linear, action-centric experience compared to other Metroid games. And it's where you can start to see the similarities between Samus Returns and MercurySteam's past work on Mirror of Fate. The similarities start out simple and superficial enough. Both games seem to run on MercurySteam's own proprietary engine, and both games use a similar camera system to pan over the interconnected rooms of each area. Then there's the slightly more substantial details, like how the Aeon abilities are mechanically similar to Mirror of Fate's magic system, which revolved around expending MP to buff yourself either offensively or defensively for enemy encounters. But then there's the much broader, all-encompassing similarities. Both games heavily focus on a slew of combat mechanics, take place in linear worlds where backtracking is never required, and rely on teleporters as a band-aid solution for truly interconnected areas. At the heart of these comparisons between the two games, you can find that Samus Returns even shares entire game mechanics with Mirror of Fate. The melee counter in Samus Returns was outright confirmed in interviews to have been heavily based on Mirror of Fate's parry system, while 3 of the Aeon abilities have direct counterparts in Mirror of Fate's sub-weapons and spell system. In spite of their similarities though, Samus Returns shows that MercurySteam had a better grasp on that balance between action and exploration compared to Mirror of Fate. Samus Returns' overall structure may be linear, but the compromise for that linearity is a slew of areas that make more elaborate use of your upgrades for both progression and for optional item expansions. While the map as a whole never bridges different areas together, each individual area still involves exploring and finding upgrades to gain entry into new, inaccessible paths. There's never really a point where any of your upgrades are redundant, meaningless, or gimmicky. Just about everything you pick up in Samus Returns is used up to the very end of the game, making for an experience where every ability is meaningful, and getting 100% completion is more about snappy puzzle solving, rather than sheer reflexes on the player's part. Naturally, none of this is to sell you on the idea that Samus Returns is some misunderstood masterpiece. Though I personally feel the game is too often judged against AM2R, with some of its merits seen as mistakes needing to be fixed, there are still some pretty glaring shortcomings. One of Metroid's greatest strengths has always been its heavily interconnected map design, so the heavy reliance on teleporters in place of that feels like a blatant step backwards. Not to mention, the same mentality behind Mirror of Fate's restrictive level design is not only still present in Samus Returns, but it's also incredibly blatant by Metroid standards. Let's just say that for fans of sequence breaking in Metroid games, Samus Returns was not made with you in mind. While not the most well-rounded Metroid game, Samus Returns is still a game that showcases an incredible amount of growth on MercurySteam's part. Mirror of Fate was a more linear, action-focused experience, but it was also half-baked, disjointed, and unrefined. Samus Returns may be linear and action-centric all the same, but despite its new features and shortcomings, it's still recognizably Metroid. There was at least a clear attempt to push Metroid's core gameplay further beyond what was introduced in Super Metroid over 23 years earlier, even if it was almost exclusively centered around combat options. In their time with Metroid, MercurySteam had found a way to design areas around Samus's full repertoire of upgrades, knew their way around some mechanically tight boss fights, understood the art of show, don't tell with the game's story, and even added several new elements into the series just begging to be explored further. It's hard to shake the feeling that if MercurySteam wasn't limited by the foundation of Metroid 2, they could make a game that was truly special. Maybe even a game that was legendary. Metroid Dread is the culmination of a concept that took 16 years to finally realize. After the release of Samus Returns, rumors started spreading around that a proper Metroid 5 was in the works, but in another bit of irony, its true nature as Metroid Dread was never part of these rumors. Neither was the fact that MercurySteam, fresh off their work with Samus Returns, was the one to continue the mainline Metroid series for the first time in 19 years. Metroid Dread's development is long and storied, but seeing that I have already made an entire video dedicated to it, that's really not something I'm gonna get into here. What's important to emphasize here is that after nearly 2 whole decades since the series' last original 2D entry, Dread was left with some huge shoes to step into. Suffice to say that expectations were high for MercurySteam to not only match the series' best, but also make a game worthy of the mythical status that Dread had built up after 16 years. Whether MercurySteam pulled this off or not is something you can easily find out by watching one of the many reviews online. But even that won't compare to playing through Dread firsthand and experiencing a game that I feel more than makes up for the 19-year wait. In my eyes, Metroid Dread isn't just a game worthy of standing with the series' best, but it's also the greatest proof that MercurySteam came to have a stronger understanding of what makes Metroid work. MercurySteam's first 2D side-scroller, Mirror of Fate, was almost exclusively centered around combat. Their next 2D game, Samus Returns, tried adding more combat elements to a series generally driven more by its exploration. Metroid Dread is the game where the developers successfully balanced both action and exploration together. You might say this sounds like MercurySteam only managed to accomplish the bare minimum required of a Metroid game, but I truly think it goes beyond that. Metroid Dread is built from the exact same gameplay foundation as Samus Returns was, with all the same gameplay mechanics even returning from that game. However, while these mechanics were used to increase Samus's combat options in Samus Returns, Dread instead uses them to emphasize Samus's movement options. The original Aeon system relied on countering enemies to get more Aeon energy, but in Dread, it's a permanent fixture of Samus's kit, now running off of a short cooldown gauge. Samus Returns' Aeon abilities were mainly meant to give extra options against the game's stronger foes, but Dread's 3 Aeon abilities cater to a very different set of needs. The returning Pulse Radar and the new Phantom Cloak are respectively reserved for either completionists or those clutching out saves against the enemy encounters, which leaves you with the only Aeon ability to have widespread use through the entire game. The Flash Shift is a short, instant dash that works either as an evasive option or to just maneuver around the world faster. This means that not only are there no combat-focused Aeon abilities in Dread, but the most accessible one is purely movement-based in nature. Even the melee counter, a mechanic derided for being too defensive in nature, was reworked so that it could be used offensively, giving players the means to quickly counter attacks on the move without sacrificing their own forward momentum. It may be a small and simple fix, but it's an important one that plays into Dread's overall focus on player movement. Beyond further streamlining and refining gameplay elements from prior games, the only new addition to Samus's base abilities is one of the most fundamental maneuvers in all of gaming: a slide. And if Metroid Dread's maps were built in the same way as Samus Returns, with extremely dense enemy placement and narrow corridors, none of these refinements or adjustments would really change much in the grand scheme of things. But these maps aren't built the same way. Metroid Dread has the benefit of releasing on a proper HD system, lending the game to much larger rooms and way less screen crunch compared to the cramped real estate of a 3DS screen. The areas of Planet ZDR are also much more spaced out compared to the depths of SR388, giving both you and the game's more lenient enemies some much needed breathing room. Thanks to Dread's more spacious level design, using your movement options to outmaneuver enemies is now just as valid an option as facing them head-on. Even just having that luxury to pick and choose your own battles instantly gives Metroid Dread the best moment-to-moment gameplay of any of MercurySteam's 2D games. But what would happen if you were to lose that luxury? Metroid Dread owes its name to the game's themes of fear and dread, centered around the idea of being confronted and pursued by an overwhelming force. The embodiment of this concept would turn out to be the nigh indestructible pursuers known as the Emi. While you previously had that luxury to engage or disengage from normal enemies in Dread, the Emi's ability to instantly capture and kill on contact forces you to avoid them completely. It's entirely possible that some of the changes and additions made to Samus's movement are partially owed to the inclusion of the Emi, since you have no choice but to outmaneuver them through resourcefulness, intimate knowledge of Samus's movement options, and complex predatorial enemy AI still hasn't been perfected in gaming even today. Well, they can't all be winners. While the Emi's very inclusion is a contentious point among some, the byproduct of their inclusion is a set of unique sections built entirely around testing the player's movement and their spatial awareness. These are both concepts that can be immediately applied to the entire game, with your movement options only growing more robust through upgrades like the Flash Shift, Spider Magnet, and Speed Booster, which, by the way, is even more technical compared to its last appearance in Zero Mission. If Metroid Dread's greatest improvements lay in a bevy of new movement mechanics with rooms designed to take advantage of them, then that'd be a strong, respectable accomplishment by itself. But Planet ZDR's overall structure is far removed from the depths of Dracula's Castle or SR388. Part of Metroid's strength as a whole lies in its map design, and MercurySteam took greater care in crafting an entire playground for players to use their newfound maneuverability in. The differences between ZDR and MercurySteam's other 2D games are no clearer than in each game's opening moments. The first act of Mirror of Fate starts with 4 main areas before the game's first boss, but these areas either involve walking in a straight line or slowly ping-ponging from one end of an area to another. The most exciting bit of deviation comes when you have to break away from the main path for about 2 minutes in the Forgotten Caves to get the Spirit of Belnades, but then you're still slogging through the deadly waterfalls block-pushing puzzles until you reach the game's first boss in the Castle Hall. There's not much more to these maps beyond either holding right or occasionally bouncing across the maps exactly as laid out to you, piece by piece, area by area. By comparison, Samus Return's earliest areas have a lot more interesting things going on. The surface of SR388 is just one large tutorial area to get your bearings in, generally doing a better job of sneaking you around compared to any of Mirror of Fate's earliest areas. By the time you've done one full U-turn through the surface, you've been introduced to the gameplay essentials, gotten your first 2 upgrades, and even killed your first Alpha Metroid. However, the following area has 4 Metroids to hunt and 3 upgrades to bag before you can access Area 2. You won't be able to make much progress until you make a short detour to get the bombs, after which they can be used to move ahead and snag the ice beam just a few rooms away. Either one of these can be used to move a few rooms higher up and nab the area's last remaining upgrade, the Spider Ball. From here, you're free to take out any of the 4 Metroids however you like, but the path up from the Spider Ball conveniently brings you right next to an Alpha Metroid and a hidden energy tank in the same room. You ultimately cannot leave the area without killing every Metroid and getting every upgrade, but Samus Return's first area already gives players a bit more wiggle room in how they want to tackle SR388. Metroid Dread starts out similarly enough, with its tutorials being worked into the beginning of its first major area, Artaria. Like MercurySteam's other games, there's not much room but to move through a set of linear halls until you're thrown to the wolves with your first proper Emmy encounter, whisking you to the higher levels of Artaria, constantly being teased with doors and pathways you can't take yet. From here, you cut across almost the entire map and the Emmy room one more time to get the charge beam, which happens to be right next to where the entire game started. Not even 1 hour in and you've already done an almost full revolution around the game's first major area. Now armed with the charge beam, you can open all those locked doors near the start of the game, make your way to the central unit, and snag the new Spider Magnet ability. From here, it's a straight shot to the first boss and your first Aeon ability, nudging you northeast towards the game's next major area, Cataris. All throughout Artaria, Dread has already hammered in the idea that each major area is made up of different rooms that are part of a larger, interconnected whole. For instance, Artaria involved lowering water levels in one room to progress in others, and redirecting lava flow in one room so it opens a door in another part of the map. Cataris further builds upon this idea, instantly teasing you with hot areas that are inaccessible, forcing you to take another route as you redirect the planet's lava flow to unlock doors, cool down rooms, and reactivate machinery in the region. It's not long before you're introduced to the second Emmy, having to constantly weave in and out of its own zone as you unlock more and more of Cataris. Once you finally manage that, you would assume killing the second Emmy is your next move. But this is where Dread starts sidestepping expectations and hides the central unit behind a locked door. Up until now, the path Dread has you take is fairly straightforward, but this marks the exact moment where Dread entrusts the player to figure the game out on their own terms. The next step involves finding the entrance to the next major area, Dairon, just to take a short detour so you can restore power to part of the region and snag the wide beam. You're then given a short taste of the third Emmy as you loop back around to Cataris, where you can then kill the second Emmy and finally regain the Morph Ball. While going back to Dairon seems like the move to make, the game instead expects you to backtrack through Artaria just to bag the Varia suit, funneling you into a one-way teleporter back to Cataris, leading you closer to the game's second major boss. At least, assuming you're following the game's default path of progression. Alternatively, you could backtrack through Cataris and back to Dairon, where you can find a set of hidden areas only accessible with the Varia suit. From here, you can use a slide jump, a maneuver that isn't even hinted at or required to beat the game, to reach an elevator and get the grapple beam early. From here, you can take another detour to bag the bombs early and even slide right into the game's next major area to pick up the flash shift. At this point, you could go back and fight that second boss already, or you could push further and get the speed booster, super missiles, and screw attack early through a mix of intentional movement tricks or unintended collision quirks. It may sound like I'm saying that it's strictly the return of sequence breaks and skips that solidifies Metroid Dread as a worthy continuation of the series, which is not the case. To be honest, that kind of mentality isn't much better than measuring the quality of Zelda games based on how fast you could warp to the credits. The main point I'm trying to make here is that Metroid Dread's default route, even in its earliest moments, is already more complex and evolved compared to MercurySteam's other 2D games. Though both Mirror of Fate and Samus Returns had several different sets of areas to explore, Dread is the game that goes to greater lengths to create an entire world that's filled with winding, interconnected paths. Playing through Dread is never quite as simple as just holding right or leaving entire areas behind once you discover the next one. ZDR's areas are going to have to be unraveled and eventually revisited before you can move forward, with the next step not always being fed to you through a silver straw like, say, Metroid Fusion. And yes, Planet ZDR is filled with conveniently placed teleporters and one-way passages that keep you on a forward path through certain points of the game, just like in Mirror of Fate and Samus Returns. Compared to those games though, Dread's world not only has more to offer through its larger map and greater degree of interconnectivity, but it's extremely rewarding to those who go the extra mile to push against the dev-intended path. As you grow to understand all the movement options in your disposal, crafty little bits of environmental railroading can be circumvented or worked around wholesale, creating entirely new routes through the game however the player sees fit. This freedom to deviate from the intended path isn't what makes or breaks Metroid Dread, but it's an undeniable intended aspect of the game that exists to offer even more replay value, just like with Zero Mission and Super Metroid. In fact, Nintendo themselves even promoted the game with the promise of alternate routes, even directly comparing the game with Super Metroid's flexible map design. There's already a staggering number of ways to experiment with different routes in Dread, even if some of the tricks involved are maybe a little more unintentional than others. But hey, it's not like every trick in Super Metroid is intentional either. In the end, it all returns to two key words: action and exploration. Where MercurySteam had previously failed to marry the two elements into one, they've since finally created a world where the two coexist in perfect harmony. A game that manages to keep players engaged with combat just as much as they're exploring through a large, interconnected world. It's a game where you have enough agency as a player to not only pick and choose your own fights, but also how you want to progress through the world. It's all of these elements working in tandem with Dread's highly varied map design and new movement options that, at least in my eyes, elevates Dread above your standard search action release and worthy of its place in the series as Metroid 5. And in the grand scheme of things, isn't that the most poetic outcome? 2010 saw the release of Metroid Other M and Castlevania Lords of Shadow, both games hailed as killers of their respective franchises by most longtime fans. For most Metroid fans, the very heart of what defined Metroid had been completely betrayed. For most Castlevania fans, the series they cherished had been uprooted and replaced with something entirely different. Together, Metroid and Castlevania inspired an entire subgenre of video games still going strong today. And together, they died. MercurySteam had gone from being a fairly unknown studio in the mid-2000s to becoming a footnote in the story of Konami's gradual decline as a video game publisher. Whether or not you were really into their work on Lords of Shadow, it's undeniable that Metroid's future being thrown into MercurySteam's hands had some fans apprehensive. Remember, up to that point in time, seemingly little had been done after Other M's release to get the series back on track or even redeem Yoshio Sakamoto's reputation in the eyes of fans. Only 5 years ago did it seem like there was little to prove that these two parties truly understood Metroid enough to not only revitalize the series, but also keep it relevant in the face of increasing competition. It's a bit of an ironic outcome, isn't it? The same company that many accused of killing Castlevania would turn out to be the one to revive Metroid. In the words of MercurySteam's co-founder, Enrique Alvarez, "It's been a pleasure, we've learned a lot. Honestly, Nintendo has made us a better developer. I'm not gonna lie to you, they are extremely demanding. They require the very best constantly, all the time and beyond, but it's been a great experience." It's just a shame that Nintendo never taught MercurySteam about better working conditions. Shortly after Metroid Dread's release, Anai Games published an article featuring first-hand accounts of workers involved with the project, recounting the game's chaotic and mismanaged development at MercurySteam. Some of the highlights in this article include the game's original scope calling for double the bosses and cutscenes, which was far beyond what MercurySteam could realistically manage within deadlines. That was the least of the project's problems, though. According to the same article, there was also a much greater issue with poor communication and treatment from MercurySteam's higher management that rippled throughout the company, leading to poor working conditions at the height of a global pandemic, workers being indiscriminately laid off, and developers going uncredited for their work on Dread. By the way, that last point was directly confirmed by MercurySteam themselves to be the result of an internal company policy. I know, it sounds like I'm undermining the entire video by dragging these reports back into the spotlight. But given that this whole video has been centered around MercurySteam's body of work, it'd feel disingenuous to not acknowledge these reports at the very least. These issues may not be unique to MercurySteam or even the video game industry as a whole, but I still feel it's important to make a firm distinction here. The development teams behind these games that I've discussed today, the coders, designers, artists and all, are the major parts of MercurySteam that this video was really about. And following Metroid Dread's release, it looks like a good chunk of them have recently parted ways with the company. Make of that whatever you will. Game development is a messy-ass business, and I'm not gonna act like I can speak for everyone or that I know everything there is to know about it. What I do know is that credit should be given where it's due. If Metroid Prime can still be heralded as one of the greatest games ever made, despite being made in one of the more notorious crunch periods of its time, then there should be room to discuss MercurySteam's work in spite of the company's working conditions. Metroid Dread may have been the child of a chaotic development cycle, but that doesn't mean there's no silver lining waiting at the end of all this. While members of the game's development team felt stifled and undervalued by MercurySteam, some were still able to find solace within each other's company and pride in being able to be a part of Metroid Dread's development. In the words of one of those anonymous accounts from MercurySteam, "The relationship between colleagues and the day-to-day with the foot soldiers was amazing. I had a great time and I've never laughed more at any other studio. And even though there was a sense of competition, that's normal in creative jobs because we all want to be the best." It pains me to not be in the credits for Metroid Dread because it makes me so proud. This game is already part of the history of game development in our country.